Has anyone ever heard of Padre Pio? Anyone ever heard of him? No. He is... Oh, yes. Oh! Look at his hands. Does anybody know what that is?
Stigmata.
Yeah, can someone say?
Stigmata.
Stigmata. Yeah, can you explain what that is?
The signs of the cross of Christ on his body.
Yeah, that's when they spontaneously start bleeding. Isn't that weird? I mean, isn't that great? He's kind of weird, though. He lived from 1878 until 1968. And so that's a photograph of him with a stigmata. I've never seen that before. He was also known for bilocating. Bilocating is when you are in more than one place at a time. And apparently there's lots of accounts of people seeing him other places in the world, even though he was known never to have left Rome from 1918 on. But my coolest thing is this. Often when he had stigmata like that, people could smell roses in his presence. I want that. Like, I really want that. So today we're considering the topic of confirmation. Thank you, Paul. We're considering the topic of confirmation, and for the sake of this talk, I have chosen to interpret that as the decision that you make throughout life to choose to continually pursue God. You're confirming your faith. You choose to pursue God, like Padre Pio did, presumably. And further to that, I'd like to focus specifically on the kind of personal experiences that people can have with God that can convince us of the reality of God and of God's love for us. Most of my own spiritual journey has been about changing my understanding of who God is. As a child in church, I was constantly told what God was like and what he expected of me. No one ever asked me about my experience of God. No, I don't think it occurred to anybody to ask me. They weren't remotely interested in my understanding of God as a child. The child's understanding of God was completely unimportant to the adults in my life because they believed they already understood who God was and what he wanted from me. But whether the adults knew it or not, I had a keen awareness of God from a very early age. I have such clear memories of a child of sitting in this particular place in the forest, my little secret place, and I would sit there for long periods of time happily by myself. I had a great view from that spot, and really I was meditating. I didn't know it at the time, but I was meditating. I always had a profound sense of peace and sense of unity and love with the world. And if that's not an encounter with God, I don't know what is. At the age of 25 was the first time that I became really disillusioned with who I had been taught God was. I think I'd mentioned to some of you before that my understanding of God was kind of like a celestial dentist who did things to you that were really unpleasant but were good for your character in the long run. Like God sent along trials that were kind of like awful root canals, but ultimately relieved pain and suffering in the future. I was okay with that image of God until our first child was stillborn. And then when that happened, the only conclusion I could come to was that God was okay with killing off your children if it improved your character. And I thought, that's just plain sadistic. I didn't want anything to do with a God like that. But the problem was, I couldn't just forget about God because my experiences of God had been too real. So after a while, I decided that image of God couldn't possibly be true. And then gradually, I developed this intense, deep desire to really know God more personally. See, the thing was, like I said, most of my understanding of who God was, sorry, I'm just smiling at Shannon, who got the baby to go to sleep without a soother. Sorry. Most of my understanding of God had come from what I'd been taught in church. And the idea that I could have my own experience of God and come to my own understanding of God's love and interest for me by listening to my own inner experiences was never put forward. But I read about people like Padre Pio who had these experiences, and I wanted them. I just didn't know how to access them for myself. So in a desperate effort to feel something other than anger at God, I did what I been taught to do. Read your Bible, pray every day, pray every day. Remember that? I did that almost pretty much daily for 2 years. I read my Bible and prayed every day for at least 15 minutes, and nothing seemed to change or happen. I had no more experience, a personal experience of one myself. See, I was mad. I was miffed because I thought, this is not a difficult thing for God to do. Like, I had all these positive emotions for my husband, Paul. Like, how hard would it have been for God to drum up some of that towards him, right? And I do say him because my understanding of God was at that time that he was male. So in my frustration, I went to our current pastor, and I'm dying to tell you his name, but I won't. I went to our current pastor and asked if he, aren't you proud of me, Paul? So tempting. So I went to our current pastor, and I said, asked him if he knew of anybody who could spiritually mentor me, because I really wanted that. So I'm not making this up. He said to me, "Oh, my wife would be delighted to meet with you, and you guys can get together and talk about child rearing and recipes." Oh. Really? Like, did he not hear me say spiritual mentoring? Anyway, luckily God was more on the ball than this guy was. And I got invited to this Catholic spiritual retreat weekend, and I went with my cousin, Celinda, if any of you know her. And there I met a trained spiritual mentor. I had never heard of such a thing. I did not know people were actually trained in the art of spiritual mentoring. Through God's profound grace to me and this woman's incredible kindness, I saw her every week for 13 years to talk over what God might be doing in my life, how God was always calling me to more love, more grace, more peace, more freedom, and more joy, if only I could hear. I credit this woman, Dorothy McCartney, a good Catholic, for a large part of who I am today. She never flinched at my extremely legalistic evangelical views at the time. She just waited for God to reveal to me a more loving way to see the world, and I was happy to leave the beliefs behind myself. It was her that helped me recognize and ask for the spiritual experiences I long for. So I thought I'd give you a few examples of some of the spiritual experiences I've had and some other people I've met. So you may have heard of me tell of a time a few years ago. I was on this spiritual retreat, and it was a course on prayer, and we were doing a thing on Ignatius prayer, and I had done that lots and lots of times, using your imagination to pray. And that day I could not enter into it, and I was very frustrated. Because I had done this successfully, I might add, many times in the past. And so at the end of the allotted time in my imagination, so I'm sitting, and Jesus and I are just leaning up against this kind of warm rock wall, just chatting. So I said to Jesus, "Jesus, what's wrong with me? Why can't I do this prayer today? I've done this lots and lots of times before. What's wrong with me? Why is there always something wrong with me?" And Jesus looked at me and said, "Of course there's something wrong with you. And then he indicates all the other people sitting there and he goes, there's something wrong with everybody here. And then he stood up and yelled to the crowd around us, hey, guess what, everyone? There's something wrong with Pamela. And they all start laughing hysterically. He says, no one's really surprised. Forget about it. Stop wasting your time thinking about what's wrong with you. Instead, focus on me. Look around and see what I'm doing and how you can be a part of that. And then he quoted back to me one of the quotes I like, which is, your shortcomings are neither the most important or interesting thing about you. Other people have told me about their experiences with God. Since Christmas, I have met 3 people who have heard the audible voice of God. That's never happened to me. Lucky. In a moment of real crisis, they heard God speak to them very clearly. I don't know if the people around them could hear the voice or not. I asked the one lady who was telling me about this, and she was in a really upsetting point in her life, and she was sitting up in bed in the middle of the night, and she heard the audible voice of God. So I said, did your husband hear it? Because he was there, and she was like, I don't know, he was asleep, he never said, so I don't know. And then this last week, I spoke to someone, get this, she was at a spiritual service or an encounter, and she smelled roses. I'm so jealous. Her husband was not with her when it happened, but when she went home and climbed into bed that night, she lay down and he goes, what's that smell? And she goes, what do you mean? He's like, it smells like flowers or something. He could smell it too. Isn't that something? That's what I want. The spiritual experiences of smelling roses as a presence of God. Actually, I ordered some rose oil. What do you call it? Essential oil? Rose? Because then I thought, I'll just put it by where I'm praying, and then I can pretend that I can smell the presence of God. But I have trouble with migraine. It just gave me a headache, so I gave that up. Now, I'm fully aware that some of these experiences can sound pretty wacky, but as far as I can tell, God does not seem to be concerned about how wacky she or he comes across as. So I'm still asking for the rose thing. Just that line of the song that you guys sang struck me, the reckless love of God. Is that not reckless? No, you don't need to smell roses. So really you can ask for whatever you want, but it doesn't mean it's going to happen. In the language of Catholics, spiritual experiences with God, personal spiritual experiences like this are called consolations. My buddy St. Ignatius defines consolations as palpable experiences of God's lovableness. He says, these experiences act like a magnet, drawing us to desire greater union with God and putting in good order our affections towards all other created realities. But, as one of my spiritual mentors always used to say to me, Pamela, we seek the God of consolations, not the consolations of God. I'll say that again, it's a bit hard to get on the first time. We seek the God of consolations for who that is, not the consolations of God, not just the experiences. My most recent experience or consolation is a huge shift that's happened to me in about the last 2 years or so since our grandson was born. And his birth brought back so many memories of when our children were first born when they were little. And I tell people all the time, I did not cope well when our children were first born. I say that all the time to people. But do you know what? God has helped me realize that actually, considering everything, all the awful things that happened to me through ages 23 to 27, I cope pretty frickin' well. Let me count for you the ways my life sucked back then. At age 23, I was told that debilitating headaches that I was having all the time were actually migraines that I had inherited, and they would be with me for the rest of my life. Could not be cured. They were going to be my faithful companion for many years. And then one night, when my roommate was away, a man came in the middle of the night and kicked in my apartment door. And so that woke me up when he kicked that in. And so I got up and confronted him. He didn't harm me physically, but I got just a wee bit of PTSD from that event. And I've never spent the night by myself since that night, because I still get kind of freaked out. Someone said, "What do you do when Paul goes away?" I'm like, "Stay at my sister's." So anyway, the day after that happened, the guy kicked in the thing, I met Paul, which was a good thing. So at age 24, I married Paul and got pregnant. At age 25, our first child was stillborn. And then I got pregnant 3 months after that. And at age 26, our son Ephraim was born. And he was premature when he was born. And so he had to be put into the special care nursery for about 10 days and be intubated and all that kind of stuff. And that was really traumatic for me. And then I developed severe postpartum depression, except I didn't know it was depression because I didn't know what depression was. I just thought everyone else was lying through their teeth when they told me how great it was to have a baby, because I hated it. Then I got pregnant again when Ephraim was 6 months old. Do not try this at home, friends. It's not a good idea. Anyway, and then partway through that pregnancy, my membranes ruptured and I was put on bed rest for 3 months. But thankfully, at the end of that, our son Ian was born full term. I know the following sounds a little melodramatic, but it's true. From there on in, our lives were improved remarkably because we weren't worried about our children dying all the time. That was a hard go. So the other day when I recounted to this revelation of mine, of realizing I'd actually coped pretty well to Paul, he goes, "Good." I'm like, "What do you mean, good?" Always ready to take offense. He said, "I have been trying to convince you of the truth of that you cope pretty well in such difficult circumstances for over 30 years now, but you could never hear me." Okay, I'm a slow learner. But God finally got through to me. I wasn't that incompetent after all. Yes! Now, I've described to you today what I hope are some compelling personal experiences with God. Do you think I, or the others I spoke of, can take credit for these things happening to us? I don't think so. And whether you believe in the events ascribed to Padre Pio or not, do you think that he can take credit for these strange happenings? I don't think so. Can I take credit for the fact that I have always wanted to be known and know God? I don't think so. Of course, I'd like to take a little bit of credit for my spiritual desires, because that would make me feel better about myself. But I'm not really sure it's true. Question is, does God really give people different amounts of desire for God? The Democratic part of me says, no, of course not. Everyone has the same opportunities to know and be known by God. And it's up to each of us as individuals to choose how much we respond to God or not. Not only does this seem more fair to me, it enables me to have a wee bit of pride in myself, because it might appear with being a pastor and everything like that I've chosen to pursue God more than some other people. But I'm not sure that that's true. From what I have observed and experienced, and from what I have read, this simply doesn't seem to be true. The idea that God isn't fair, and I do realize the irony of me deciding what is fair and not God. The idea of God not being fair with doling out spiritual desires bothers me. Doesn't God owe each of us the equal opportunity to grow in our faith, isn't it up to us somewhat whether or not we succeed in our spiritual journey? Isn't it a matter of just simply trying, in a very humble way, of course, trying harder to be transformed by God? Even as I say those words, they sound ridiculous. So what if God doesn't give each of us an equal amount of spiritual desire? Now, what worries me about this idea, it just might be a cop-out for me being called to work in the slums of Calcutta with Mother Teresa's order of nuns. Here I am worrying that what's holding me back from hearing my calling to work in Calcutta in the slums is the fact that I hate being hot and sweaty and I hate eating really spicy foods. But maybe that's not it at all. Maybe God hasn't given me the desire, so it's not really my fault that I don't want to go to India. That would be a big relief. But isn't that just an excuse for not wanting to do unpleasant things? I always worry that I'm not doing my best, that I'm slacking off. So if God does give each of us varying amount of spiritual desire, what is the point of our Lenten theme this year, plant something new? Did you notice I gave Jesus a plant to hold? For the rest of Lent? Okay, plant something new. Okay, so take the commitments that a lot of us have made to try on a new spiritual practice during Lent. What's the point of us disciplining ourselves to do spiritual practices if it's up to God how much spiritual desire we get in the first place? What's the point of spiritual formation, spiritual practices? Well, just like my question about different people having different amounts of spiritual desire, I don't know the answer entirely, but I will tell you my best ideas so far. Regardless of the amount of spiritual desire that you have, spiritual practices are about learning to be quiet enough to hear your inner voice, hear God speaking to you, maybe in an audible voice, maybe in your imagination, or maybe just with the smell of roses. Is your inner voice and God speaking to you the same thing? I don't know that either. Maybe, maybe not. Are you making it all up? I don't know. But once you start hearing the voice, which in my experience can be frustratingly quiet and vague, you will begin to uncover some of your truer self, your best life. You can let go of trying to conform to what you think other people think you're supposed to be like, and focus instead on what you're supposed to be doing here with your one wild and precious life. I guess the biggest thing that has changed for me and the people I know who have had these kind of spiritual experiences with God is that they have confirmed my faith in a worthy God. And even more importantly, I have come to both like and love God and myself a lot better than I did 30 years ago. When I'm doing spiritual mentoring for people, I often pray for them for more love, freedom, peace, joy, and hope. And when I look back on my life, I can say that's exactly what's happened to me. My life is wonderful. Difficult things still happen, but they don't rock me to my core the way they used to. I'm so grateful I accepted God's invitation to know her, him better, and myself through some of the experiences. And I pray that if you desire it, you will have some of these spiritual experiences that will change your understanding of God. And I also pray that the spiritual practices that you have chosen to undertake during Lent will open that door for you to hear more clearly that beautiful inner voice. Amen.